I'm Justin Glaw, writer and journalist, and I've spent my career chronicling the violence, unrest, and chaos of American life. On this podcast, I'll discuss the events roiling this complex and troubling country and speak with some of the people trying to make sense of the madness that pervades our world. This is American Doom. Hey everybody, welcome to the American Doom podcast. Today I'm talking with Arturo Dominguez, who runs the Decolonized Journalism Substack newsletter. And since Arturo and I spoke this afternoon, the government has filed a response in the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who is an El Salvadorian national who was wrongfully, mistakenly, whatever you want to believe, deported by the Trump administration and now is at the notorious CCOT prison down in El Salvador. And basically what the judge in the case has said since Arturo and I spoke was that the Trump administration needs to explain now, basically, what efforts it has made to bring him back. There's been a lot of developments in this case over the last few days. Arturo and I discuss all of this as well as a few other immigration matters, including some developments about Houston law enforcement working with ICE to detain migrants over there. So, as always, follow all of our social media for American Doom. And if you want to subscribe to the newsletter, we're at american-doom.com on Substack. As always, a paid subscription or a few dollars in our coffee fund is the best way to support our work. Thanks. Arturo, thanks as always for joining me. There is a lot to talk about in terms of immigration stuff. I am never not amazed by this administration's ability to sort of oppress people on a variety of fronts. We've got tariffs. We've got extrajudicial renditions to other countries. Unconstitutional executive orders related to elections. Very, very busy administration and what I've started to think of as a regime. The first thing I wanted to touch on today is what Democrat Chris Van Hollen is calling the abduction of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. And last night, the government missed a deadline of sorts to respond as to why it is that they're disobeying two court orders to get Garcia back into the United States. And what's interesting to me about them missing that deadline, they eventually filed their court filing, but they missed it by like over an hour. And then when the court filing came in, it was only like 3 pages long. And the only thing that it really said in it was it mentioned El Salvador President Nayib Bukele's comments yesterday in the Oval Office where he said, like, well, I can't bring the guy back to the United States. Like, that's the only thing that government lawyers said after all that extra time that they needed to come up with their response. So I just wanted to point that out and then have you kind of weigh in on this absurdity of both the White House and Bukele sort of pointing at each other and going, well, I can't bring them back and you can't bring them back. So what are we doing here?
Well, with Bukele, it's so the one thing people tend to forget is that, El Salvador's under martial law.
Yep.
So, based on that alone, he's the president. If he wanted to get somebody out of a prison, he could. Just like a president could here. He's basically trying to suggest that, the courts have his hands tied, on how he can act. But, we're talking about a guy who ran for re-election despite the El Salvadorian constitution not allowing him to run for re-election.
Sounds familiar.
He won, but he ran anyway. He disregards everything Trump is doing. Bukele has already done. And I think that's where these two guys find so much common ground. But when it comes to Abrego Garcia, who is serving as a good example of what's going on, is there's no evidence that he was in any gang while in El Salvador or part of any gang while here in the United States. So that it speaks to Bukele's crackdown in El Salvador and how he's locking people up. He's locked up more than 1% of his population And there's varying different numbers about percentages of who's innocent, how many people are innocent that are in those jails. And when you look at what they're doing to Abrego Garcia, they have him locked up based purely on rhetoric. There's no actual evidence to back up anything they're saying. It makes you wonder, really, how many El Salvadorans are in a prison that have done nothing. They were just at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Right.
The worst thing Abrego Garcia ever did since he's been in this country since 2011 was he was picked up for supposedly loitering at a Home Depot trying to get some
Right.
day
He was
labor
with
work.
other day laborers trying to get work.
Right. And they took him in for loitering, and then they called ICE. And he was held in jail, went through all this court stuff. And while the judge denied his asylum claim because he filed it too late, he issued him a deportation order. The thing with the deportation orders is just because you've been issued one doesn't mean you're getting deported. In his case, the judge also ruled that deporting him back to El Salvador would be dangerous for him because the whole reason he's in the U.S. was he was running from gangs in El
Right.
Salvador.
Right.
So to suggest he's a gang member is just, it's out there. I don't even know where they're, what they're using to justify saying that. He doesn't have any gang tattoos or anything like that. And when the judge issues a deportation order and says that he's protected from deportation, he's essentially stateless at this point. Abrego
Right.
Garcia is, because he can't go home, but he doesn't have asylum here. And that's a legal protection that's there for a reason.
Which we
To try
have,
to say,
which we are lucky enough to have here, and people in El Salvador are unlucky enough to not have there. Because as you point
right,
out, in El Salvador, if Bukele or his people say you're a criminal and you're going to jail, that's it. There's not, they can totally sidestep due process and any of the rights that we take for granted down there, which is, by the way, why none of Abrego Garcia's lawyers are in El Salvador's courts trying to get him out of there. They're in our courts because we still have the rule of law, where El Salvador at this point really doesn't, right?
right. At the end of the day, for the Trump administration, it's a phone call, right? That meeting at the White House. If Trump wanted to, he
Yep.
could have just said, "Hey, we need to get this guy back," and Bukele would have, "Okay, cool, I'll get him back for you."
Right.
But that wasn't asked for. Bukele's whole little stint at the White House it was all prepared statements. It's almost like the White House told him what to say. Just, pretend you can't do anything. We can't do anything, right? Because we can't, quote unquote, force another nation to make decisions for us. We do that all
Meanwhile,
the
they're
time.
trying to force other nations to do all sorts of other things. I mean, we're talking about invading Greenland for mineral rights or some shit like that. But like, somehow we don't have enough power to get a guy out of El Salvador. I'm sorry, I don't buy it. Right.
Right. Yeah. I don't know that anybody does. And, the whole thing, you look at that and you look at how they're doing, like the Mahmoud Khalils and all these other cases where they're going after students and taking their permanent residency. Some are, some people are being told to self-deport, and they have citizenship.
Yeah.
So, the way this administration is operating is, it's sloppy, which makes them even more dangerous.
Mm.
And I don't, for Abrego Garcia, he's in an El Salvador prison, but then, you think about all the people that have been just forced to stay on the Mexican side of the border, living in tent cities. And, the inhumanity of our immigration system isn't new. It's just how Trump is using it that is.
Mm.
He's find that, I've always called Tom Homan the king of loopholes, and they're finding every loophole that they think they can use to justify what they're doing. And they're moving so fast that, our legal process is slow. So, the courts can't react fast enough. Congress certainly can't react fast enough, you
Right.
know. I think Congress is just lost about what to do. But I think the right approach right now are the civil liberties groups who are filing the lawsuits
Yeah.
and really taking it to the administration. I think the administration is losing more than they're winning in court. The problem with it is they're just ignoring the court.
Right. And that's
They're
where,
supposed to be facilitating Abrego Garcia's return.
yeah, they're supposed to be facilitating, and that has been the operative word here for the last 48 hours, right? Like, and this is where the courts really are not, like a lot of our institutions, are not prepared for an authoritarian type regime that just doesn't care about rules, laws, or norms, right? Because you and I and a lot of other people, when the Supreme Court says you, the Trump administration, must facilitate the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, we all know that means bring the fucking guy back, right? But the Trump administration is saying, well, we don't know about facilitate. We'll offer up a plane to send down there if only Bukele will release him. And then, like you said, then Bukele comes to the Oval Office and he says, well, I don't really have the power to release him. I mean, he's a criminal and he's in prison and therefore he has to stay there, right? Which is just a load of garbage, right? But then the administration takes that, and that was the basis of their filing last night, that they said they cited Bukele's appearance in the Oval Office as saying, well, I can't get this guy out of here. So we have an instance in which that check of overreaching executive branch power, the courts, says you must do this. And now we're arguing over the meaning of the word facilitate, right? Which I think is another example of like just how unprepared all of our institutions are for somebody like Trump. And so now Abrego Garcia is stateless and caught in between. And the ACLU and other groups are fighting on his behalf. And that's pretty much his only shot here, right?
Right. Yeah. And then when in the whole White House thing when Marco Rubio spoke, this was also pretty telling too, because now, Abrego Garcia is an El Salvadorian citizen. But they're using this other angle that, well, he's an El Salvadorian citizen and we can't tell El Salvador what to do with their own citizens.
Right.
And they're passing the buck, right? They're overlooking every law and right that they just trampled over. And this new approach is, I don't know. I don't think that's going to hold up. Rubio's whole argument is that the courts don't have a right to decide on U.S. foreign policy. My response to that is they do if you're breaking the law.
Right.
We do have laws regarding foreign policy. We do have laws, criminal justice laws. We have all kinds of laws. So the fact that he's trying to turning Abrego Garcia into a foreign policy debate, or trying to, because I don't think it's going to work.
No,
it is also pretty telling. It just shows the inhumanity. It just shows the inhumanity of the administration, how little they care, and how they're almost getting a kick out of doing this.
Right. And I think to me it
so
shows
telling,
that
we talk.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say we talk about like the Christian nationalism and the white nationalism and the racism in this administration, and it just really shows through in the way they're acting right now.
Yeah, and I think the way that is most ever present in terms of evidence of that they feel that people like Abrego Garcia are less than other people in this country is the nature of the fact that they just straight up say this guy has no rights, which, I mean, that the foreign policy thing of Rubio's is just sort of insane, right? Like, what are you talking about here?
Right.
You're saying that this one guy is evidence of an entire foreign policy plan, and therefore the courts are overstepping. No, what the courts are saying is that even undocumented immigrants who are here have certain rights. They don't have every right that U.S. citizens have, but they have certain rights. And one of those rights is the right to due process in immigration court, where if ICE or DHS or whoever says this guy's MS-13, that guy gets to go to court and say, no, I'm not, and here's why, right? And that is the right that they have essentially ignored. Because when we talk about the evidence of our Abrego Garcia being MS-13, it comes down to an ICE agent who spotted him in a Chicago Bulls jersey and hat, which is like a symbol of the gang, right? And a confidential informant that then none of this was either made admissible in court, and he was never convicted of any crime related to his supposed gang affiliation in MS-13. But because some ICE agent said so in 2019, the administration has taken that as concrete fact and said this guy's a gang member, so he's got to go. And then therefore forget about his right to due process in immigration court, which is, to your point, evidence of their inhumanity and their fundamental view of people like him as less than, right?
Yeah, it's when you listen to all the anti-immigrant rhetoric from the campaign to now, it's very Latino-phobic. It's Latino-centered. Like every time they mention, and you see this across the news media too, when they talk about the southern border or they talk about migrant crime, or it's always followed by something about Central America, about Venezuela, or so they make that association over and over again. And essentially, when people think immigration, they think about the border and they think about brown people. Mm-hmm. They don't think about the green card process. They don't think about visas. They don't think about anything. The immigration system is huge and it's bloated. Yeah. But every time you mention immigration, it's always focused on, and that's just the way we're trained to think about it. You automatically think Latinos. It used to be, we were all Mexicans. It's still that way in some places, but now it's just Latinos, and they overlook the amount of Russians and Ukrainians and Africans and Asians, and there's all kinds of people. There's a huge diverse population that comes through the border, but it's all Latino-phobic. And when you saw Stephen Miller, he's up on stage, he has pictures of people who've been convicted of crimes and they're all Latinos. Do you want these people living next to you? No, we don't want those Mexicans living next to us. And that's what you get out of those rallies, and that's what makes those rallies really feel like a Klan rally. Yeah. And it's just insane because when Tony Hinchcliffe said the whole Puerto Rico trash thing, that's just a sign of that. That's how normalized it is on that side of the spectrum. And it's really strange to me that they don't see their own racism when it comes to that. Their xenophobia, because it's just so overt. It's all pretty really obvious, overt, and they don't even realize it. Right? It's normalized. It's normal to think mass deportations are justified, and that's where this leads to, right? It leads us as a society to a point where, well, yeah, we should deport the criminals, right? And then it comes to the question of, okay, so what is a criminal? To MAGA, anybody who crossed the border, which is a legal process to claim asylum, are illegals. And that's they think, to MAGA, they think there's 30 million quote unquote illegals in this country. There's not. There's 13 million undocumented migrants, and the vast majority of those are legal in the system, awaiting this long, daunting, dragging out process. And they just assume everybody's a criminal, and those criminals are Latino.
And if you blur the lines,
that's how they're treating this Abrego Garcia.
Yeah, and if you blur the lines of, okay, so it starts with criminal immigrants, right? That's what they love to say, right? Okay, well, criminal's kind of mushy in this instance. And a lot of other instances, by the way. There's been lots of reporting about a lot of the guys who got sent down to CCOT in El Salvador did not have criminal records. So what are we doing here? Are they a criminal because they're MS-13 and they murdered somebody? Or are you just saying they're a criminal because they entered the country maybe illegally and forget about the whole immigration court process? Is that what we're saying here? Because now we're moving the goalposts on what a criminal immigrant is, right? So it goes from criminal immigrant to, I think, eventually where this goes is just immigrants, right? And we're not going to be kicking out
Right.
Russian immigrants who are renting penthouses in Trump Tower in New York City, right? We're going to be kicking out brown people from Central and South America and Mexico. I want to also touch on the unfortunate situation at an ICE facility where a Chinese immigrant committed suicide. You reported on that last week, and then if we can talk about Houston before we head out.
Sure. Yeah. So the thing with the Chinese, I mean, the ICE detention facilities out there in the Tucson, Arizona, California area, this particular facility in Yuma have a terrible, terrible history with, human rights issues, how they treat migrants, a lot of abuse, a lot of reports of abuse, sexual abuse, things like that. This Chinese migrant, she was overstayed a visa. They took her in and they took a man with her. They put them in separate facilities. The issue with what occurred really starts to fall on the misconduct of the agents. They're supposed to be doing rounds every hour or two to check on the people in detention, and apparently that wasn't being done. And they give migrants those Mylar blankets that look like aluminum foil, which apparently she tore off a piece of that, tied it off in the spot where the toilet is, where there's a little wall. And the whole time they could see her through the cameras. And she tied it around her neck and, committed suicide. The thing was that the agent that was supposed to be making the rounds had documented that he did the rounds, but according to camera footage, he did not. Rashida Tlaib brought this out like before any releases came out from Border Patrol, and everybody was trying to verify this, and it took a couple of days, but Border Patrol finally verified everything she said. The initial pushback was that the rounds were done and all this happened out of the view of the cameras and it wasn't our fault type of a situation. And then it turned out that everything Rashida Tlaib said was true. And there's so far, I haven't seen any sort of disciplinary action being taken against any of these agents who claimed they made their rounds, who claimed they couldn't see anything on camera when it was all really visible. But that's just par for the course. When it comes to Border Patrol and ICE, they're the least, oversought agencies. There's very little oversight, and they get away with a lot. There's a certain rape culture in Border Patrol agencies. If you ever talk to Jen Budd, former Border Patrol agent, she has a whole story. I mean, there's a whole history there. Brutality, abuse. When I was talking about the Chrome Detention Center in Miami, that facility is just as bad. It's has a maximum population of about 500, and there's 1,700 people in there. They can't meet the needs of those people. They don't have the infrastructure there. So, these agents, there's been so many cases of abuse towards Black migrants, towards Chinese migrants, Middle Eastern migrants, Latinos, and then the opposite end of the spectrum, which always drives me nuts, is, when the war in Ukraine broke out, it was really frustrating for a lot of migrants and a lot of advocates to see Ukrainians being able to walk past all those people who were forced away to Mexico and get a free pass at a point of entry at the Mexican border. That was pretty frustrating to see, because we know what happens to migrants in detention facilities, but it doesn't happen to white migrants, So and that's it's really obvious. It's really obvious. So all of that plays a role. When you see, one of the things that's so alarming to me is seeing how so many federal agencies were just gung ho to go help ICE do these
Yeah.
raids. Something
And
like
local law
I think they
enforcement
said
agencies too.
right. Something like 4 out of 5 DEA agents right now are doing ICE raids,
Yeah.
working with ICE. So who's doing the DEA's job? If fentanyl is really that big of an issue, why are you
Hmm.
taking the people tasked with stopping fentanyl off the street to do this? And it's everything they want to do is unrealistic. They're not going to deport 13 million people like some of these MAGA think they're going to do. Apparently, some leaked information out of the White House is saying that the administration's goal is to deport 1 million people by the time his first term ends. And that's going to be really horrible for migrants and for Latinos in this country, because we're going to have to constantly look over our shoulders and carry our passports and all this extra stuff just to prove we're citizens.
Yep.
And at the end, he's falling short of what he promised his voters.
Right.
Like he's essentially admitting he can't do what he thought he could do.
And in the
It's
process,
ridiculous.
engaging in just like the biggest like mass civil rights violation since Japanese internment
Yeah.
in World War II, right? I mean, like you said,
Right.
literally every person who is not white, you better keep your driver's license or your passport on you, because if that's what they're talking about doing, they're gonna get stopped. And like it also, with that number of people, like you mentioned before about the sloppiness, like when you are talking about trying to deport that many people, inevitably you're going to get sloppy with it. Inevitably, you're going to pick somebody up and he's the wrong person, but he's got the same name or something like that. And you confuse him,
Right.
and now you deport him. And now you've got a Supreme Court case on your hand. I mean, how many cases can the Supreme Court hear if they're already having to deal with the case of a single deported migrant in less than 100 days of the Trump administration? Like, is the Supreme Court just going to become our de facto immigration court system as they're kicking all these people out of the country? It's sort of insane to think of it that way, but it seems like that's really what they're trying to do. And then in addition to all of the things that federal agencies are trying to do, a lot of local law enforcement is also really gung-ho to help those agencies out. And that's what you...
Yeah. So, in Houston, the Houston Police Department has always had a policy of, we don't do federal law enforcement stuff because we can't afford to. Houston is a huge, huge city. The
Yep.
sprawl is just spread out, right? And we have tens of thousands of cops and billion-dollar budgets, and then you have the Harris County Sheriff's Department, all that, right? Working with ICE is not a very popular thing in a town where more than 100 languages are spoken.
Yep.
Especially when it comes to immigration. There's rough estimates that there's roughly 600,000 undocumented people in the U.S. in Houston. And right in Houston, and those, they're a mixed bag, right? Some have pending cases, stuff like that. But when it comes to local police, like, they're from the community, and this community is not a real big fan of these raids with no warrants and, targeting people in whole communities and stuff like that. Everybody, like I said, most migrants have their cases pending. So most of these people don't deserve to be snatched up like the people we're seeing snatched up everywhere, which ends up taking some U.S. citizens and detaining them for a day or two, whatever. But the whole Houston thing, the Houston Police Department swears that they have not changed their policy on working with ICE. The Houston mayor says he's not going to ask HPD to work with ICE. That said, there's been cases. One of the ones that I covered in my story was a woman was driving to work down through downtown. Her car suddenly catches fire. She calls 911. Oh, my car's on fire on the highway. Cops come, run her ID, and they see an administrative warrant in the NCIC database. So they're like, we got to take her into custody, right? They think it's a warrant. The thing, what happened is ICE dumped 700,000 administrative warrants into the criminal database.
Okay.
The thing is these are administrative warrants. These are civil cases. They're not. That's one of the.
It's not the same as a warrant. It's not the same as having a warrant out from the Houston Police Department because you're wanted for a robbery. This is basically a court notice to come to court to deal with your immigration case. Right.
And they dump that in there, and that's one thing that a lot of people don't understand is even if you did cross the border illegally and got caught, it's a civil penalty, right? It's not like you get prison for it. It's civil, as in you get thrown out, and you might get banned for 10 years from legal entry. But to dump all those warrants in there, now there's that case. There was a couple of other cases where a migrant got into a car accident. They took him into custody, threw him in the ICE processing center in Montgomery County, one county north of here, and HPD says they haven't changed their policy, but HPD officers are arresting these migrants and sending them to detention centers. So, I've been trying to find out what's going on here because they won't answer anyone's questions about this. But it's starting to look like maybe some of these officers are, like we were saying, gung ho, and they might be working unilaterally. So, if they see a warrant and they call ICE, and ICE knows that the officer's standing right there with the migrant, the officer's probably standing there saying, well, they know I have them. I got to take them in now. I can't confirm that that's the case, but that's what it seems like it's happening. That's what seems like it's happening because city officials and county officials are adamant about not working with ICE. The Harris County Jail here does have an ICE does the 287G, but it's just for ICE detainers. So if someone goes to jail and ICE has a warrant for them to be detained, which is for a crime, then the Harris County Jail will hold them. And the average stay there is 6 months. But aside from that, around here, this is a super unpopular thing. People are in an uproar about it. Like I said, Houston is arguably the most diverse city in this country.
Yes.
So,
and the fourth largest city. Probably going to be third largest city within the next few years, right? It'll pass Chicago.
Probably. Yeah. Probably. So a lot of people don't like the raids. They don't like the way they're done. They don't like having ICE detention facilities in the city of Houston. So most of them are kind of on the outskirts. For that reason, because it's just not a popular thing. And I think, this could cost the mayor a re-election. It could end with the police chief being ousted. But I right now, just talking to people on the street, going to the store, whatever, nobody's thrilled about it. And everybody's looking over their shoulder. And, now we're in a situation where migrants and Latinos don't want to call the cops if something happens. If there's violent crime or robbery or something like that, people may not call the cops because
which is what people like Trump and JD Vance will just never understand. The reason that law enforcement in major cities is not always gung-ho to do what you've described in Houston is because they want people to trust them. They want all of these different communities, regardless of what their national origin is, to trust them. So when something bad happens, that they will cooperate with police. And if you ostracize an entire community into not trusting the police at all, you're basically cutting yourself off from every source on the street that can help you solve and prevent crimes, right? That's why you see in places like Chicago, especially, and Houston and a lot of the other big Texas cities, you see more progressive law enforcement in the cities, and then the county's like a whole other thing, right? It's always the county sheriff that's like, no, I'm going to work with ICE, right? But the conservatives fail to understand this complex relationship between law enforcement in major cities. So it's a good thing that folks like you are reporting on it and staying on top of it. Tell people where we can find your work, Arturo.
Appreciate it. Man, I'm everywhere. I'm on all the social media platforms. Same username at Extreme Arturo. Substack is, I'm getting more and more addicted to it every day, hanging out on notes and stuff instead of Twitter. But yeah, I'm on Blue Sky. Yeah. So yeah, pretty easy to find. I'm doing some work for Unicorn Riot, putting together a list of all the white nationalists in the White House and stuff. So
perfect.
That's coming along. Hopefully that comes out in the next week or so. It's pretty long.
Excellent. I'm sure it is. We'll be looking forward to it. Thanks a lot, Arturo. Thank you for listening to the American Doom podcast. This is just a part of what I do as a writer and journalist. If you want to keep up with everything I'm working on, head over to my Substack newsletter at american-doom.com.